Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. So my name's Katie and today we're going to be doing a discussion of some chapters from Trouble with Peace for the read-along hosted by gollancz. I think I'm saying that right. I honestly really need to learn how to pronounce the publisher's name properly because they're one of my favourite publishers. They do all of Sanderson's lovely books. But yeah, today we're talking about the Trouble with Peace. For the read-along, I think I'm on week 4, so we're doing from the chapters, I think it's chapter 28, which is Fire with Fire, all the way through to and including chapter 36, which is The Wolf's Jaws. So basically this video will be spoilery, so we're going to be discussing those chapters of The Trouble with Peace. So if you haven't read The Trouble with Peace, bye-bye. And I would highly recommend reading it because it's such a good book, honestly. I reread these chapters for this, but I've read it all before. I love it, it's one of my faves. I'm reading The Wisdom of Crowds right now, which I'm also loving so much. We'll just get into the chapter discussions and I'll have timestamps for each individual chapter as well. And I think when you put timestamps in the description, it like sections it out so you can kind of see along the bottom bar. So anyway, so the first chapter, Fire with Fire, which is chapter 28. Yeah, that's right. We are from Clover's POV. So Clover's never been my favourite really, but we get him. He kind of reminds me of Costa from Best Served Cold. So he is with Stour and Calder in their hall, and they're having wizards coming to visit them because they obviously are trying to go up against Ricky because Ricky's just... by the way, I always say Ricky. I know it's technically pronounced Ricka, but I can't pronounce it that way in my head, so I have to say Ricky. She's just kind of taken over Uthryth. I think that's how you say it also. So now Stour Nightfall is trying to fight fire with fire, so he's trying to find a wizard. Yeah, so then Baez gets mentioned, which always makes your ears prick up. I feel like Baez is that... I'm going to put this down. Baez is that one character who in First Law is always just kind of there, like lurking in the shadows, shaping events, and like when he's not there you're kind of worried about where he is. But he doesn't show up or anything, but they just a couple of different kind of magicians, wizards type things to come up, and then this woman called Seth comes along who claims she has the long eye, like similar to Ricky. And Stour shows a bit of mercy, like letting her go. One of the people comes along, I've forgotten his name, but he comes along, is it Dancer? Comes along and says that Oxel, one of the chiefs from Uthryth, is dead now and Ricky's had him killed basically. And so I think then that makes like Black Calder and Nightfall realise that maybe Ricky's a bit more of a... Especially Calder, I think, realised that Ricky's maybe a bit more of a threat than she at first appeared. And I think at the end of the chapter there's just a little bit with Stour and his dad, so Stour and Calder. And I think that's an interesting relationship because throughout the books so far, Stour Nightfall's always been presented as a bit of a... I don't know, he's not very, like... He's a well-written character, but he's not a very likeable one, and he almost seems like everything he's had has kind of been handed to him. And he's not like truly a fierce warrior of the north or whatever. And whereas Calder is someone who's very much had to fight for like everything he's got, and he's very kind of clever and cunning. And I think that's an interesting like dichotomy. I don't know. I think the relationships, especially in Asian Madness, between like parents and children are very interesting. Like all the different ones. Yeah, so then we move on to chapter 29, which is called Half Treason. So in this chapter, the chapter opens with Savine chatting to Isolde, who is the wife of Isha, and I believe they had like a double wedding earlier in the book. And Savine, who is pregnant, and Isolde's kind of suggesting she might be pregnant. I always think Joe Abercrombie has such like funny ways of writing, like kind of not taboo topics, but just he's very like crude in how he goes about it. Like there's a comment that Savine makes, like she will get pregnant getting plenty of rest, or no one had ever been known to get pregnant from resting, or something like that. And I just thought that was quite funny. He's very like blunt about things, which I really like. I really like his writing style and his kind of sense of humour. Yeah, so then they make mention of Leo and Isha, and then just a tiny bit later on in the chapter, Leo and Isha are talking together and plotting about their kind of rebellion against the crown, and Savine kind of overhears this, and then she kind of decides to step in and take charge, which I love Savine as a character. And honestly, I think without Savine, it's hard because I've read it before, so I know what happens, but I feel like Savine taking charge of it is kind of a way of almost making it real, like it was just plans before, but now Serene's got hold of it and you know, like it's gonna happen type thing. Because like prior to that in this book, it's more just been Isha kind of suggesting ideas to Leo, and I think in this chapter we really see Leo being manipulated, and he is very much a pawn in other characters' games, and I think his nature of being kind of a bit naive and a bit, I think it's said about, maybe this is in a later chapter in the sections I'm discussing, but how he's always got a big heart but needs to use his head a bit more. I think that's very true, and both Isha and Savine kind of manipulate Leo to what they want, and so Savine realises that she has to go like all in, as Walter White would say, no half measures. Yeah, and I think the fact as well that Leo thinks what he's doing is kind of fighting for a cause of righteousness, whereas I think both Savine and Isha are aware that what they're planning to do is more underhanded, and they're gonna have to kind of get their claws out and get a bit morally grey. But I think Leo is a character who thinks he's very righteous, but actually he can end up doing quite morally grey things. I mean, I would say no Joe Abercrombie characters are ever like good or evil. They're always shades of grey. But I think it's interesting how and we see that as the reader, but I think their attitudes to it themselves is interesting. So like you have Leo who thinks he's like really good and like a hero, but actually sometimes he does things that are quite bad. Whereas other characters like Savine, who are quite self-aware, and again Glockter as well, he's very like aware that he's not a good person. So I think it's interesting seeing the like comparisons between them. I love Savine's little underhanded ploy of like having a stomach cramp, so she sends Leo out and then she like gets down to business with Isha, like this is what we're doing, this is what I want, and she obviously wants to be queen again. She's very ambitious, so that's her ultimate goal, and obviously she's had that goal kind of ripped away from her in A Little Hatred. So now you can see her kind of climbing her way back to the top, which I love a good, ruthless, ambitious woman. So I'm a fan of Savine. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Savine somehow comes out on top at the end of the series. I mean, I don't know how it ends. I only just started Wisdom of Crowds. But yeah, I can see her or Vic. They're my predictions. Because I feel like Vic, I don't know, I feel like I could see her like in charge of like almost like a democratic type council. I don't know, we'll see. Yeah, so then the next chapter is Private Language, so that is chapter 30, and this one is just a short chapter between Savine and Broad, and Savine is basically telling Broad that she wants him to go and get the breakers on their side, the breakers and the burners. And I think it's very interesting, especially in The Trouble with Peace, how they're kind of a subtle undercurrent running throughout, like almost this threat that's sort of lurking in the wings. And Broad, I never know how I feel about him, because he's like, what I was saying earlier about characters, we know they're morally grey, but it's how they see themselves that is quite interesting. And Broad is someone who's very like, it's like he wants to see himself as a good person, but he knows he isn't, and like his whole character is like, will he give in to that urge to be terrible, or will he like, I don't know. I think that's interesting. But so of course he agrees, because his whole character is just him like getting himself into bad situations. It's like, oh no, just run away with your wife and daughter. Yeah, Savine's basically telling him to go and try and get the breakers as their allies in the fight against Orso and the Crown. And then at the end Broad says goodbye to May and Liddy, which is like a bit, are you ever gonna see each other again? We'll never know. And it's almost, I guess it's almost symbolic. It's like Broad leaving his good side behind. I don't know. So yeah, that's that one. And then we have chapter 31, which is called Old Friends. So in this one, Leo and Savine are going north, and they're going to visit Ricky, who I love Ricky. And I think, so just before we meet Ricky, well, I mean, obviously we've met her before. Just before they get to Ricky, they're having a discussion, and they're talking about Finnery's attitude towards Leo, or like what Finnery would think of what they were doing. And I just really like the conversation. I love Finnery and Leo. Again, it's that parent and child thing. I think that's a big theme in these books. And Finnery and Leo, I think, are very... Leo is always making bad decisions, but Finnery is like... She knows it's bad, but almost because it's her son, she just has a little bit of kind of maybe a bit too much of a blind eye on it, I don't know. But yeah, so they get to the Great Hall of Uthrith, and I think it's interesting the way that the description happens, because the way it's described is very different from how it was when like Leo was a child and with the dogmen, and like it's all very cozy then, but now it seems a bit more kind of barren almost. And I think that's an interesting and maybe a sort of portent of future, is that the word, portent, omen? I don't know, of what might be about to happen. And then Ricky shows up, who I love Ricky. And Ricky and Savine have this moment, and I know it's a very far out ship, but like Ricky and Savine, honestly, if they ever decided to get together, I would fully support them, because like they have such good chemistry. And there's like a scene, I don't know if like Savine goes up to Ricky or Ricky goes up to Savine, and they're like touching or like really close, and oh, I love it. And then Zuri comes in, and then Ricky's like implying that Zuri and Savine are like having a thing, and I would also fully support that. Honestly, if all the women just wanted to go off on their own and create their own sapphic colony, I would fully be in support of that. But yeah, no, I really like them. And Ricky is so bisexual, like, oh. So then they ask Ricky for help with their war against Orso. But Ricky, at first, she's a bit kind of reluctant, obviously. And she doesn't really give them an answer, so she's a bit cagey about it. And she especially doesn't really like the fact that they want both her and Stour Nightfall to become allies with them. Because Ricky obviously hates Stour, so I think you start to see kind of a bit of bubbles of like resentment starting to appear. Then the next chapter is called New Friends, which is chapter 32, and actually I really like Joe Abercrombie's naming of his chapters, and the repetition throughout the series of names of chapters I think is really good. And also like this one, like old friends, new friends, straight after each other, and then sometimes you have two chapters with the same title straight after each other, but it's like two different characters. I can't remember if it's in A Little Hatred or earlier in The Trouble with Peace, but there's like, I think it might be A Little Hatred, but there's like A Duel with Father is like the name of the chapter, and then there's two chapters in a row called that, and then one is like Orso and Giselle, and one is Savine and Glockter. So yeah, I just think the naming of those chapters is good. So anyway, Savine and Ricky are talking, and then this is where they're talking about Leo having a big heart, but he needing to use his head a bit more. And in my notes I nearly wrote down, Leo needs more head. I mean, it could be argued that he does. Yeah, and then so this one's from Ricky's POV, and then Savine kind of leaves, and Isrin comes and says she doesn't trust Savine, which she's probably right to say that. Savine's a bit cunning. But I love Isrin and Ricky and their whole banter. I just find them such funny characters. They're definitely like, what is it called? Comic relief. And the nail shows up, so Shivers brings him back. And I like his well, it's an entrance, I can't remember if we've met him before, but I also love Shivers. But yeah, so they come back, and I guess it's almost like Ricky's gathering her allies, but we're still a tiny bit unsure of like what she's gathering her allies kind of for. And I think Ricky's ruthlessness starts to come out of it, because they're discussing, and like the Nail really hates Nightfall as well. So they're kind of saying then that they'll help, but thinking of a way where like two sides decide they're having a temporary like seizing of arms. There's definitely a word for it, and I know it. Oh, it's not a stalemate. It's, what's it called? Anyway, so her and it's Nightfall, and she's saying that that's not going to last forever. So obviously, you know that something's going to go wrong. Yeah, and then the next chapter is called The Little People, so chapter 33, and this is one of my favourite chapters. I think Joe Abercrombie's really good at doing this kind of narrative style where he switches between a lot of POVs, and almost each POV either ends at the same thing or ends, and the way it ends then just... So I think there's one battle scene, it's not in this book, I think it might be in The Heroes, where when a character gets killed, the person who did the killing then takes over the POV. So I just think that's really interesting narration style. So that's kind of what happens in this chapter. So we start with Orso and Teres, and I love Teres. And Orso and Teres, again, it's like that parent-child relationship. I just love it. They're going to visit the one of the warehouses where Kunsbrick, the inventor, is presenting one of his new kind of inventions. Yes, Sulfur shows up, Yoru Sulfur, one of the Bayaz's cronies, and he's trying to persuade Orso into accepting a loan from Valiant and Bulk, who are, obviously we all know, very shady characters. And then, yeah, so Kunsbrick is presenting his invention, and actually I've just tabbed his speech because I think it's very good and sort of, yeah, so let me read it. So there are those at both ends of the social scale who would have us change direction, those who would not only try to dam the river of progress but have it flow uphill, who would break, burn and murder in the name of dragging us back to a glorious past that never truly was, a place of ignorance, superstition, squalor and fear, a place of darkness. But there will be no going back, I promise you that. So I really like that line because I think, one, it sums up a lot of what's happening in the series quite well. And I think it just shows kind of the dangers of like populism and kind of the romanticisation of the past, but also kind of the dangers of progress at a very rapid rate, because I think that's also what's happening in the books. And the books are kind of a collision of those two things, and it all ends up in flames. Which quite literally in this chapter. So yeah, as Kunsbrick is giving his speech, something explodes, and then we kind of get a bunch of little POVs from like random people, and at the end of every bit of their section, it's only like a few paragraphs each, but there's an explosion. And I just really like that narrative device. So then that keeps going until we get to Teres's POV, who I love her POV, and then she's like reminiscing about Shallory, I'm not quite sure how you say it, her lover, and I wish them the best. And then like pining, but then her POV, the explosion happens, and we start then seeing, because she's obviously not killed by the explosion, so it keeps going, and she's like protected by one of her guards, and it's very like, it's that like post-explosion state. I feel like it's always done quite well in films where there's like the sound goes off and there's like ringing in ears and it's all a bit crazy. Yeah, and then she's like wanting to make sure Orso's safe, and then Orso kind of is fine, fine, but and then we get the POV of a breaker, and it's found that the breakers were, or burners, probably burners, were the ones who caused the explosion, and then they start coming and they're gonna start attacking like Kunsbrick and Teres, and then Sulfur then decides to step in and kill them all with his magic powers. I think they say he's like an eater type thing, although I'm not sure if he actually is an eater or if he's just a magician. I can't really remember the like lore of the magic that well from First Law. I did read it, but it was like over a year ago, over 2 years ago actually. Oh, been a long time since I read them. No, a year ago. I'm sure it was a year, more than a year. I think I finished the last Argument of Kings in about March 2020, so yeah, just over a year. Basically, Sulfur, after he's killed them all, he turns to Orso and he's like, so you'll accept that loan? And Orso's like, yeah, I will, because I do not want to get ripped to shreds. Which I'm almost thinking might be like another kind of omen of things to come, like the breakers and burners are going to rise up, and then it'll be Bayaz and Sulfur and Valiant and Bulk who are going to save them. I don't know if that's actually what's going to happen, but there could be some foreshadowing there. So then we get chapter 34, which is a fitting welcome. So this is another short one. It's from Clover's POV, and it's just Leo and Sabine arriving to visit Nightfall. And there's a lot of commentary on Sabine and her kind of majesty almost, and how everyone likes her and wants to be her. I think there's a comment in another chapter where Stower's like, he liked Leo, but the best thing about him was his taste in women or something, which is quite funny because Leo is quite clearly queer, so potentially his taste in women is, but Sabine obviously is great, but you know, I think that's quite a funny comment in the context of like the whole of Leo's character, which could be another like half an hour video on itself, Leo's character and how his like queerness is fundamentally tied into who he is and all. I could just ramble for ages about that, but that's not what this video is for. Okay, then chapter 35 is called Diplomacy. Yeah. And this is Leo attempting to be diplomatic, and again Joe Abercrombie uses a narrative kind of choice that I've seen him do a lot, and that's where he has a certain sentence which just gets repeated quite a lot throughout the chapter. I think in this one it's something like, by the dead, diplomacy was hard work. So yeah, Leo's very much a soldier and he just likes to run into danger, but obviously he's finding it hard to be a diplomat. They're basically having dinner around the table. There's a bit of a tiff between Sabine and Calder, which I love, two like cunning characters just slinging insults at each other. That's always one of my favourite things. And then Leo decides to try his hand at diplomacy and is asking Stour for an alliance, and obviously they're quite reluctant because they don't want to work with Ricky type thing again, and obviously, and also he's saying like, what benefit am I going to get out of this, because they're attacking like the Union whereas they're in the north, and Leo's trying to persuade him by like telling him about the glory of battle and things, which I guess Leo's trying his best. you got to be proud of him, but yeah. And also Leo's like commenting on how handsome Nightfall is when he's angry. Oh yeah, I'm totally convinced Leo has like a submissive kink, because there's other, I can't remember if it's before this or after this in the book. I'm pretty sure it's before. It might even mean Little Hatred, where like Sabine's slapping him and Leo's turned on by it. But yeah, that's another story. But just Leo. Okay, and then the last chapter we're discussing is The Wolf Jaws, which is chapter 36. And in this one, basically, the chapter starts with Sabine kind of watching Leo sleep. And I like this it's basically just a paragraph, but I think it really highlights the differences between Sabine and Leo. And they're not a pair that I would have put together at the start of, or in the whole of A Little Hatred, really, except till the end, at the very end. But then I don't like them together, really, to be honest. But I can see why they are together for the point of the story, and the differences between them. Like Leo's very much a kind of, especially at this stage in the story, he's quite optimistic and quite trusting, and like a little, I think Sabine compares him to a dog, and he is like a little golden retriever who's just not very smart but has to be led, whereas Sabine's quite cunning and a bit cynical and is kind of very happy to take the reins. And I like that kind of difference between them. And also Sabine, I think Sabine says something like she wouldn't have wanted a smart husband because it would have got in the way of her plans, which I think is true. Then Sabine goes off to visit Stour and Nightfall, and Nightfall's sparring, and then they have a bit of a confrontation, and there's some like, Nightfall's threatening her with a knife to her neck, but then is it really, when you're reading it you think, is it really him threatening her or is she threatening him? Because she is quite clearly in control, or that's what it kind of feels like. And she's basically persuading him to agree to the alliance and telling him that he can have Uthryth, which essentially betraying Ricky. And I was so angry with Sabine at this point, because it's like, how can you betray Ricky? And also not telling Leo, and Leo and Ricky are quite good friends, so then it's like Leo's now in the dark, and but there's a good, I don't know, I always like a good bit of backstabbing. So yeah, and that's where we leave it. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion video. Definitely let me know in the comments your thoughts on these chapters. I'd really love to know. And yeah, I hope you're all having a really great day. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time.